Hi, my name is Natasja Swanson, and as part of my honors contract for classical mythology, I read Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is a retelling of Homer's Iliad from the perspective of the female characters. The role as a whole of women in Greek society, they were largely in charge of overseeing the home. This includes the slaves and all the housework. They were also in charge of weaving, working the loom. This was seen as the peak of womanhood, like one of their chief goals in life. Helen in the Iliad was often seen working the loom, which kind of shows how she was considered to be the peak of beauty, the peak of womanhood. One of the main goals of women in their life were to have children. As we learned in class, there was a high infant mortality rate, so women often had to have many children just to have some survive to adulthood. As shown in the Iliad, women were also supposed to be obedient to the gods. This was shown when Hecuba and her group of other women were told to pray to Hera and offer sacrifice in order to turn the tide of the war. And a quote I pulled from Silence of the Girls was that silence becomes a woman, which really just emphasizes their place in life as seen by the men of both of these books. So women in the Iliad specifically are seen somewhat the same way. They are seen as a point of contention for the men. For example, Helen was seen as the reason the Trojan War started, and Briseis was what fueled Achilles' rage when Agamemnon took her from him. And then I just wanted to address this quote, which is featured at the before the Silence of the Girls main text. Divine Muse, sing of the ruinous wrath of Achilles, begin where they first quarreled, Agamemnon, king of men, and the great Achilles. And what were they quarreling about, these two violent, mighty souls? It's as basic as a barroom brawl. They are quarreling over a woman, a girl, really. A girl stolen from her father, a girl abducted in war. So this quote really shows how they look down upon women by using terms like a girl, and really question why they're even fighting this war. Achilles specifically questions that. Another main point was that the women in the Iliad really showed the dehumanization of the enemy. This quote references that no man here should be in a hurry to go home until he has spent the night with some Trojan's wife as revenge for Helen's struggles and groans. So on one hand, they're really marginalizing Helen, but they're already in this war, so they're going to put her up on a pedestal as a victim in this, and use it to back their reason for fighting. And they also dehumanize the women themselves, especially they use Briseis and some of her fellow slaves as prizes in Patroclus's funeral games. One image I pulled was that the loser of the wrestling match in Patroclus's funeral games, the loser of the wrestling match got a woman who was skilled in various crafts, and they rated her at 4 oxen. So it really shows how women were seen as a good, and not a human being. They also played, in the Iliad, women also played a large part in the mourning roles. They were really forced to show their alliance with the Greeks by mourning the deaths of the Greek soldiers. And then, as the Iliad and the Silence of the Girls specifically is really about, these women were slaves of war, so once they were captured and taken from their hometowns, they were they were bed slaves, they were servers, they were launderers, nurses, and then, as I mentioned, they were prizes for soldiers. And both of these, the mourning and the slavery, I will expand on later in the presentation. The layout of the book is a little bit different than the Iliad. It's split into 3 parts. Part 1 takes place before the Iliad, so it goes from Briseis' initial capture, her initial enslavement, until the time she's taken from Achilles by Agamemnon, which would mark the beginning of the Iliad. So then part 2 kind of spans the events of the Iliad, which would be her enslavement under Agamemnon to Hector's death. So they really fit a lot into that middle section. And then part 3 takes place after the events of the Iliad. So it's from the mutilation and ransom of Hector, which is kind of what ends the Iliad and the funeral games, until the Greeks leave Troy. They really skip over a lot of the fighting and stuff that likely happened. But they kind of show more of the perspective from the women. So moving on, I was going to go over some of the main characters that appear in both of the books, but are highlighted especially in Silence of the Girls. First, of course, is Briseis. Most of the book is from the perspective of Briseis. She is taken from her hometown of Lyrnessus. She is forced to watch her family die at the hands of Achilles, and she is taken and chosen by Achilles to be Achilles' new bed slave, basically. And then, as we know, she is taken back by Agamemnon, which fuels Achilles' rage, which is the main plot of the Iliad. And she's really treated as an object in the Iliad, being taken from back and forth between Achilles and Agamemnon. But the Silence of the Girls really gives her a voice and allows the audience to see what the story was from her perspective. Because, as I said, in the Iliad, she has no role besides being a catalyst for conflict. But in the Iliad, she is only seen mourning, having sex, and serving food and wine. And all of these are also present in Silence of the Girls, but she is also seen gaining medical knowledge, interacting with her friends, establishing a complex relationship with the Greeks, because as a result of being Achilles' slave, she becomes pregnant with Achilles' son. And so she has an extra connection to Achilles and the Greeks as a whole. And then Achilles, a description of Achilles, calling him the Butcher, is what opens the Silence of the Girls. It's from Briseis' perspective, and she discusses how he's pillaging her hometown, killing her family, killing everybody, just going on a rampage. But as the story progresses, we see that proximity influences tolerance, so they begin to kind of tolerate each other. I wouldn't say Briseis or Achilles ever really love each other. Briseis kind of mentions towards the end of the book, after Patroclus has died, that maybe they both loved Patroclus, and from there they had some sort of at least understanding and tolerance of each other. But Achilles was very much her owner. She was very much his slave throughout the whole book. In the Iliad, Achilles is seen just as a half-divine hero. He's kind of influencing how the war is going. But in Silence of the Girls, it's actually partially from his perspective, which humanizes him in a way. There's a quote that says, "He'll die as he lived, in a shadowless glare of light. There'll be no end then to his story, everlasting glory in return for an early death under the walls of Troy." So throughout the book, he comes to almost an equal standing, like I was mentioning. There's a scene towards the end where he shares a bowl of wine with Briseis. We see Achilles sharing wine with his comrades in war, his fellow soldiers. So that kind of shows that he has gained some sort of respect for Briseis, at least however much respect he can gain for a woman, because she is the mother of his child. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the discussion of the gods in this book. In Silence of the Girls, gods are not active characters as they are in the Iliad. In the Iliad, the audience sees the conflict, the Trojan War, from both mortal and immortal perspectives. So we're seeing how the gods are influencing the war. But in Silence of the Girls, Thetis is the only one who's actually seen, and she's only seen a few times. The gods are mostly mentioned through prayer and allusions. So, for example, there's interaction with the priest of Apollo, Chryses, which is something we see in both books, that scene. Chryses prays to Apollo to induce the plague to hurt the Greeks. And then gods are also alluded to when Priam comes to ransom Hector. It's assumed that Priam had to have a god's help or some god's intervention to gain access into Achilles' compound. And then it's also assumed that the gods helped to preserve Hector's body. Thetis was another character that was, she's more prevalent in Silence of the Girls than she was in the Iliad. She really represents womanhood and motherhood in Silence of the Girls. They kind of go into her backstory, not too much, but in reference or in comparison to Briseis and Helen's story, because Thetis was captured and kind of forced into a mortal marriage, and Briseis was similarly captured and forced into a relationship. Not really a relationship, but forced to be a bed slave. And Helen, I put a question mark there because there's debate whether she was kidnapped or she went willingly into her relationship with Paris, but I still think there are some similarities between the two. But either way, Thetis is restless to return to her homeland like the water. And in a similar way, Briseis wants to return to life in Lyrnessus. And Helen wants the war to be over. It repeats that in the books. It's repeated that Helen regrets that this war is going on because of her, and is feeling grief for all the Greeks and Trojans dying. Throughout Silence of the Girls, Achilles' interactions with Briseis are really shaped by Thetis. A lot of the sexual relations between Achilles and Briseis are shaped by this, and that's something that's definitely unpacked throughout the course of the book. And as I mentioned earlier, Thetis is the only god who's actually seen in Silence of the Girls. On page 182 of Silence of the Girls, she is seen coming out of the water to comfort Achilles after Patroclus' death. Helen is also another significant player in both of these books, obviously. But in in the Iliad, she is seen as a victim of the gods, kind of mourning her role in the conflict. Kind of traditional, women should be silent and apologize for their role in society. But in Silence of the Girls, she's a victim of mortal men, which I thought was interesting. They really, like I said, humanize a lot of these players, like Paris. One quote I pulled was, "Poor Helen, raped on a riverbank when she was only 10. Of course, I believed her. It was quite a shock to me later when I found out that no one else did." And that was, of course, from Briseis' perspective. In both of these, though, she is seen as the cause of the Trojan War. And I added this quote that whenever Helen cut a thread in her weaving, a man died on the battlefield, so she was responsible for every death. Even though she was sitting in Priam's castle, she was still seen as the reason for all of this fighting and the reason for all of the death. But at the same time, she was no longer a person, but an item to be won. So this quote I pulled, they all believed that Menelaus would kill her when he got her back. He had said so many times. Some of them were inclined to think that that was a waste. F her first, then kill her. So it really shows the status Helen has dropped to because of either her choices to go with Paris or not even her choices. Just unfortunate circumstances really changes her status, her social status, and what her morals are seen as. And then finally, Patroclus is another character I thought played an interesting role in both of these books. He has an interesting standing because he acts as a middleman between Achilles and kings or Achilles and slaves. He's looked down upon as doing whatever Achilles wants them to do, but he's also identified as the only one who can stand up to Achilles. He is a catalyst for the story, much in the same way that the women are. He obviously stands in for Achilles when Achilles is not able to go into war, but that moves the story along after Patroclus' death. And Patroclus' standing, in my opinion, is somewhere between a slave, a comrade or a fellow soldier, and a lover of Achilles, because they really highlight, though it's debated by historians, they really highlight that there may have been a deeper relationship between the two. And in the Iliad, he's compared to a girl. On page 305, Achilles says, "What are all these tears about, Patroclus? You're like a little girl pestering her mother." So he definitely does not have the same standing as a slave, but he also does not have the same standing as Achilles and Agamemnon and other soldiers like that. And finally, he's an ally to slaves in the Iliad, and he says that he's an ally because I know what it's like to lose everything and be handed to Achilles like a toy. So he cares for Briseis after she's been beaten. He really empathizes with her. But interestingly, he also still keeps his own bed slaves. So that really adds another level of nuance to his character, and shows that he is neither slave nor full soldier, which I think makes his character very interesting. So moving on to like the major themes of Silence of the Girls specifically, but also the Iliad. Firstly, religion and power. The first scene in the Iliad is that of the plague of Apollo, but that actually doesn't come until part 2 or the middle part of Silence of the Girls. As we know, the priest of Apollo comes to ransom his daughter Chrysis, who is the slave of Agamemnon, but the priest of Apollo is denied by Agamemnon. Chryses calls on Apollo then, because he is the priest of Apollo. He calls on Apollo saying, "Lord of plague, Lord of mice, revenge your priest if I've ever sacrificed anything for you." And Achilles does, but in Silence of the Girls, this scene is really used as a characterization tactic for Briseis. It's right in the beginning. So the time of the plague shows Briseis working in the medical huts, learning from the Greeks, talking with her fellow female slaves, and in the Iliad, the plague is described as Apollo's arrows, which shows that the plague is tied to the gods like everything else. The gods have the powers. In both of them, Achilles is the one to convince, but so is the Oracle of Apollo, saying we have to give the girl back on Iliad page 4 and in the middle of Silence of the Girls. And then another major theme is exogamy, which is something we learned about this semester. In the Iliad, Helen references Priam's kindness, but contrasts it from the rest of the royal family, saying like they're taunts and they treated her poorly. In Silence of the Girls, there's a flashback to Briseis' interactions with Helen. Helen discusses how she was rejected by the women of the royal family, much in the same way as it did in the Iliad. A quote said that Priam always treated her with the greatest courtesy, though he must have known that the people of Troy, and particularly the women of his own household, hated her. So this is similar. I kind of drew a connection between Briseis and exogamy to Achilles. Obviously, she did not have a choice in that relationship, but she kind of becomes the bride of Achilles when she is taken away from her family, because her family has been murdered, and then she gets pregnant with Achilles' baby, and really, whether she wants to or not, assimilates to that culture, the Greek culture. One of the biggest themes in both of these books is slavery. Female enslavement was seen as inevitable by men from both sides. It was seen as a natural part of war. Briseis in Silence of the Girls says, "Achilles killed my brothers, and now I sleep in his bed," kind of lamenting her situation. And Priam, who has come to ransom Hector, says, "Well then, now you know what happens to women when a city falls." So he really does not have a lot of empathy for her, unfortunately. In the Iliad, women are really seen as prizes. That's really shown in Patroclus's funeral games. Iphis, who is Patroclus's bed slave, is given away as first prize in the chariot race. And then, as I mentioned, another woman was given away as the loser's prize in the wrestling match. And Andromache also laments her situation, or her impending situation in the Iliad. Both her and Hector fear Andromache's inevitable sale into slavery if the Trojans lose the war, and the sons' lower standing in life if they lose. Continuing on with slavery, in Silence of the Girls really shows the dehumanization of slave women. Briseis says, "I was a slave, and a slave will do anything at all to stop being a thing and become a person again." Women and slaves are kind of similar in there, that they were really treated as objects and goods, things to be bought and sold, in both the Iliad and Silence of the Girls. Another interesting occurrence was that when these women were not sold into slavery, but captured in war and brought into slavery, they were considered really neither Greek nor Trojan. This interesting quote from Silence of the Girls says, "Some managed to convince themselves that if the Trojans broke through, they'd greet us as their long-lost sisters, but would they? Or would they see us as the enemy's slave girls, theirs to do what they liked with?" Finally, slavery, a lot of the women thought it was better to die than to be captured and sent into slavery, because it was kind of inevitable that they would be raped, they would serve a life of servitude, and then die in slavery and not really have any advancement. They'd be reduced to a lower status in life. So there's a couple instances where they consider that death is better than slavery. In one of the first scenes, Briseis' cousin Ariana jumps to her death when the Greeks are raiding Lyrnessus. And then one of the ending scenes, Polyxena, who is the youngest daughter of Priam, is being basically killed on Achilles' funeral mound, and some of the women say, well, it's better that she dies on Achilles' funeral mound than to live a life as a slave, because she was very young. She was like 15 years old. Another major theme that was present in The Silence of the Girls was defiance and camaraderie. There's lots of discussions between women, specifically Briseis and Chryses. In one scene, Chryses apologizes to Briseis that she has to take her place as Agamemnon's slave when Chryses is ransomed back to her father, the priest of Apollo. And then Briseis and Helen have lots of conversations when Briseis goes to visit her in the castle, and they find friendship in each other in the cold royal environment. Even though these women have been captured into slavery, they still attempt to retain their culture as an act of defiance, and also they find camaraderie within each other. Briseis says, "As we worked, we sang songs we'd known from our childhood, the songs our mothers taught to us." So that's a way that they are keeping their culture alive despite their bad conditions. And then also Briseis, as an act of defiance, really decides to improve herself. When she's working in the medical tent, she throws herself into her work, and this quote shows that. It says, "I really started to think I can do this, and that belief took me a step further away from being just Achilles' bed girl." And then finally, a poignant act of defiance from Briseis. She throws a sheet over Hector's body after he's dead and laying in the courtyard at Achilles' compound as a way of showing respect for the dead. And speaking of death, The Silence of the Girls and the Iliad really take different approaches to discussing the dead. Specifically, I noticed in Silence of the Girls, the description of the dying and the dead really contrasted the gore of the Iliad. So, a couple quotes from Silence of the Girls. One is, "But the dying man, his face wiped clean of pain, cradled his spilling guts as gently as a mother nurses her newborn child." So that's right front and center on page 12, really catches the attention of readers, and shows that the perspective is very different when you consider it from the perspective of a woman. And then Briseis also says that men's mouths were open like scarlet flowers, in reference to the bloody mouths of soldiers dying below her on the street. And then they also, at the beginning, use death as a motivator. When Briseis' family is killed by Achilles, it motivates her character to kind of retain her strength and stay strong, even though she's going into horrible circumstances. Yes. And then Patroclus' death is also, as we know in both books, used as a motivator for Achilles specifically, but it also comes at a time when Briseis is kind of given up hope. So it also kind of motivates Briseis to still remain strong. There's also different descriptions of death in the naming of Achilles' rampage victim. So when he comes back from his time away from the war, the author, or Briseis, names Achilles' rampage victims in relation to the women in their lives, which humanizes the Trojan side, shows that Briseis has been talking to other women, and really implies that Briseis' conversations have been happening with women around the camp, and that there's differing interests in remembering the dead, from the female perspective to Homer's perspective. Homer really talks about just the lineage of men who are dying, and then physically how they died. Finally, Polyxena's execution at the end of the book, like I had mentioned briefly before, it shows Briseis' complicity with the Greeks, which was something I found interesting, because she is the one who leads Polyxena to the funeral mound to be executed. There's kind of an internal conflict for Briseis because she is Trojan, but she has a half-Greek son with Achilles, and she has been living with the Greeks and really forced to comply in a lot of ways. So her complicitness with the Greek cause is really shown here. Finally, one of the biggest themes between The Silence of the Girls and the Iliad was mourning. One of the main actions done by women in both books was mourning, and Trojan women were forced to mourn the deaths of Greek soldiers. In Silence of the Girls, Briseis says, "The laying out of the dead is women's work, as much so in Greece as it was in Troy." So it makes sense that when Trojan women were captured in war and became slaves, the Greek had no other women to do the laying out of the dead, the preparing of the dead, so that job was given to the Greek female slaves. And it was more of a public display of compliance than an actual feeling of sorrow among women. It really showed the power that the Greeks had over their slaves. One quote from Silence of the Girls was, "In public, Helen was forever beating her breast, blaming herself for the part she'd played in starting this ruinous war." So she wasn't mourning the death of an actual person, but mourning the war and all the people that have died because of as a cause of her role in the war. So I added some pictures here that show death scenes that are inspired or show scenes from the Iliad. And all of these women that I've highlighted are either Briseis or other women who are mourning the dead, especially in these first three. These show Briseis mourning the dead, and after reading Silence of the Girls, it really calls into question whether she was really sorrowful at Patroclus's death or just acting like it in order to get by. Finally, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about some pivotal moments compared between the Silence of the Girls book and Homer's Iliad. And I want to do that through analyzing Homer's use of space in the text. Throughout the Iliad, Homer allocates more text to the more important deaths. So that would be like Patroclus, Hector's death. People of higher status usually get more words dedicated to their death scene, and I think that Pat Barker tried to emulate that. And you can definitely compare the differences in scene lengths between the Iliad and Silence of the Girls. So I have some examples. Hector's death scene in Silence of the Girls was only 26 lines. It just briefly mentioned it. And those are prose lines, not poetry lines like in Homer's Iliad. But if we consider the Iliad was 333 lines long for Hector's death scene, there definitely is a big difference in what Barker considered important and what Homer considered important. And then the discussion of Apollo's plague I also thought was interesting because Silence of the Girls uses 849 lines about, which was what I estimated from 26 pages of writing, whereas in the Iliad, the plague from start to finish only lasts 21 lines. So that really also shows the difference in what the authors consider significant. And then finally, Patroclus's death scene in Silence of the Girls was 47 lines of text, and in the Iliad it was 78. So those were both considered somewhat important, but if you are comparing it to the others, the Iliad definitely took up some more space. Finally, I wanted to discuss the significance of Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls, and the significance of reimagining works and rewriting stories. In one way, it's a way for women to reclaim the narrative. Homer's Iliad really does not discuss women except for in the objective sense of a good that is given out among men and their role as slaves. There's a repeated idea in Silence of the Girls that's emulated in the quote, "Her fate was decided without her." This happens for Helen, Briseis, Thetis, Chryses, and Andromache, to name a few. They were all of their fates were really decided without them. And in the Iliad, they were they were just okay with that. They just kind of sat in silence. But in the Silence of the Girls, they take back the narrative and stand up for themselves and establish their significance to the story. A quote that I pulled from Silence of the Girls, "I looked around the room, listening to a slave sing a Trojan lullaby to her Greek baby. I thought, we're going to survive. Our songs, our stories, they'll never be able to forget us. Decades after the last man who fought at Troy is dead, their sons will remember the songs their Trojan mothers sang to them. Will be in their dreams and their worst nightmares too." So this brought me back to the idea we had talked about in class this semester of what makes a myth, and the criteria of it being widely believed, in a time of otherness and that stuff. But I think the continuance of the story, Pat Barker's version of the Iliad, The Silence of the Girls, came out in 2018, so people are still reimagining this story and analyzing how different characters may have considered this conflict and how it may have affected different groups, such as women, such as slaves, and allows for us to see the whole story in a new light.